My name is Alexis Rodriguez from the LGBTQ History Museum of Central Florida, and I'm here interviewing Bruce Ground on March 12, 2021, recorded at his house in Orlando as part of the museum's project in capturing the oral history of Florida's LGBTQ community. With us is Jose Arajo, recording this interview. Bruce Ground has been part of Orlando's LGBTQ community for several decades, and his pioneering role in creating a safe space has not been forgotten. Bruce Ground opened Out and About Books, Orlando's first gay and lesbian bookstore, on May 20th, 1992. This bookstore, which will later be discussed, provided not only a safe space for many, but hosted various fundraisers for the local community till its closing in 2021, becoming a recognizable part of Orlando's gay history, to which brings us here today. Bruce, could you start us off by telling me a bit about yourself, such as your childhood and your life?
Well, let's see. I was born in Kentucky, 1962. I was told by my father that it was a cold, frosty morning, and that my great aunt Mamie was one of the first people to come to see me, along with another Uncle Carl. Uncle Carl was a country guy, and he, when he saw me, he was crying and blubbering and saying, "That's a fine boy you got." And Aunt Mamie was the one who gave me my name. She wanted me to be called Robert. My mother was going to call me Bruce Leroy. So my great aunt said, no, he needs to have the name Robert. And you didn't argue with Aunt Mamie very often, so I became Robert Bruce Ground. I lived on the farm that my family owned. We still own it. And was, I kind of describe my childhood as Southern Gothic because, our family was, friends and neighbors to people like Dory Franklin, who was a bootlegger and a conjure woman, and the Ida Washer family. They were midgets, actually little people. Back then it wasn't as politically correct, so they called them midgets. And hellfire preachers, and we'd go to the river to fish. The Indian House Bluff to hunt for arrowheads or things like that. So it was a southern childhood, and I went to school in the local town, Smiths Grove, and then in high school we were bused close to Bowling Green, to Warren East, and then I went to the local university for a couple of years, Western Kentucky University, and then in 1985 I met Richard, my first lover, and we moved to Florida. Well, I met Richard in 1984, so we moved to Florida in 1985, and I've been in Florida ever since. Originally we were in Brandon, which is next to Tampa, and after 4 years or so, Richard and I broke up, and I was kind of at loose ends, so I was at the downtown library one day, and I met a guy. He asked me to go to the Metropolitan Community Church in Tampa. I'd never really heard of the MCC before, but you know, being a gay church, I thought, well, I'll go, and I thought maybe I'd, you know, meet people, or, you know, become a little bit more involved, and that's where I met Gary. Gary Bailey was my partner for 10 years, and while at the MCC, while, you know, I was still kind of feeling my way around, one of the parishioners took me home one day after church, and we were talking, and he said something about his always wanting to open a bookstore. And I'd always been around books in my room at home. You know, my dad had always gone to estate sales and bought boxes and boxes of books, and they were all on shelves in my room, so I'd always been around books, and I told the guy Marty that you know, we should start a bookstore, and we, you know, talked a little bit more, and we decided that we would open a gay and lesbian bookstore. There had been one that had closed not too long before us, owned by two women. I can't remember what the name of that store was, but one of the women, Victoria Cassette, became a friend, and so we made plans to open up, and in October, I think it was October 3rd of 1987, we opened Tomes and Treasures in Tampa, and it was in the back of a restaurant, a gay restaurant called Moody's. Moody's was on Moody Avenue, and it was a long building with you know, a deck stretching around from the front to the side, and at the side is where our store was located. There was a deck, and then a room, probably an old bedroom at one time, and it wasn't that big. It was maybe 10 by 12 at the most, and Gary built shelves for us, and we bought shelves and things from the flea markets, and we opened up, and our initial, well, and even through Out and About Books, I always had room for not just gay and lesbian books, but old books, you know, things that were a little bit unique or interested me in some way, illustrated books. There was one that I can remember. It's an illustrated book, probably published in the late 1800s, early 1900s, about Pocahontas, and it was, you know, illustrated in color, and it was a kid's book, and I had it for a long time, and finally sold it to somebody who used it here in Orlando when they were doing Pocahontas. So he used it kind of as an inspiration, I guess, for his part in the movie, the Disney movie. So we always had um, gay and lesbian titles, but we also had other things too. And there was a guy who had, his name was Mr. Hubbard, and he donated a lot of his collection to the church. And you know, being part of the MCC at the time, we got, you know, a large portion of those books and magazines and stuff, because, you know, they couldn't, you know, have the physique pictorials from the 1950s in the church, so we got them instead. So there were you know, old physique photographs, you know, of people like Ed Fury or Steve Reeves or things like that, which back in the 1950s, that was gay porn. You know, some of them were in posing straps, some of them were, you know, completely nude. The past and the present always kind of met somewhere, wherever, you know, we were. After a couple of months, we opened in October. After a couple of months, Jim Carzano says that they're moving the restaurant to be with Baxter's, which is a bar, or was a bar. I don't know if it's still around or not, but they were going to a building on Dale Mabry, and they were going to have the restaurant in part of the building and the bar in the other part of the building. They didn't ask us to go along, so we had to find another place. So we went to the place that the previous gay and lesbian bookstore had been located in. It was a cinder block building, probably is a little bit longer than this room here. There were two rooms, front room and back room, and the front room didn't need much. The back room did, so we kind of blocked it off for a while, and as we grew, we started expanding into the back room. Of course, the most popular section was always, no matter where we were, were the adult magazines, the men's magazines. No matter whether it was Tomes and Treasures or Out and About Folks, it was always the most popular spot. And I'm sure that some people with narrow minds would call me a pornographer, but let me assure you that even though we did have some stuff that would be considered pornography, that we also, the majority of our stuff would have been mysteries or science fiction or romance, and the lesbian population was always our best customer as far as books go, where guys would buy maybe one book. The women would always buy 5, 10, 15, 20. Didn't matter, because they were readers. They were more in tune with the written word, whereas guys were more in tune with pictures. We were there for, for a majority of my stay in Tampa. It would have been probably about 3 or 4 years that we were in that location until, I sold the store and we moved to Orlando. Marty was our, and I'm not going to give his last name because he sometimes gets a little weird about his part in the bookstore. We got along fairly well, but I was there more than he was. He had a job in social work, and so he, worked, pretty much 9 to 5. I didn't. I had a job at the time, but I quit so I could devote myself to the bookstore. By that time, Gary and I were together, I would do things like, okay, well, we need shelves, so Gary, can you build us some shelves, please, pretty please, please. And he would say, yes, of course, I can build shelves. And so I'd come up with the plans, he'd build them, and, I'd say, okay, let's put them in and we'll surprise Marty. Well, we did, and unfortunately he took it amiss that we were doing things without his input. But my defense is that I was there more. I knew what we needed. I knew what needed to be done. So I couldn't, the store couldn't be run by committee. We had to do what we had to do. If he had made the same decision, I doubt that I would have been upset. I would have been good. We needed shelves, but that's neither here nor there. So our relationship became a little bit contentious at the end, but I still considered him a friend, and I think he considered me a friend, but how things are. You never know what other people are thinking. Anyway, he sold his share out to me, and I went along with trying to build the store up, and we became a premier bookstore, basically, even though it was in kind of a dinky building that was kind of hidden behind 2 houses. You had to come to the driveway between the 2 houses, and it had originally been like a garage apartment or something like that, maybe a mother-in-law's house or something like that, for the previous owners. But we became a big deal, and there was one guy, Dick Heidemann, who was an older guy. He was probably in his 60s or 70s. He was retired from government service. He lived in Washington and then moved to Tampa when he retired. He had been, to all the larger cities like Washington with Lambda Rising bookstore, and Philadelphia. I can't remember the name of the store there, but different lights, city lights. The bigger and the more established bookstores we could hold our own with, because we had just as many titles as they did, and we had you know, that extra little something with the older books and things like that. I mean, anytime I went to a yard sale or a flea market or went home to Kentucky, I would always pick stuff up for the store. You know, things like old magazines, old movie magazines from like the 1920s with silent film stars on the cover, things like that. So, so we had a unique perspective for the store, and in 1991, Gary came to me and said, okay, I've been transferred to Orlando. He worked for he was a heavy truck mechanic, so he worked for Hunt Truck Sales, and he was transferred to Orlando. So he came to me and told me that he had been transferred, and said, okay, well, when do we move? Because, I mean, even though I had the store, you know, I wasn't going to, you know, leave Gary and stay with the store. So we made plans. I put the store up for sale. There were, you know, several people who were interested in it, but of course they didn't have the funds to, you know, purchase the store. Finally, Bill Knopf came to me and said that he wanted to buy it. And finally, in February of 1992, I think March 1st was when I actually left the store for the last one. I think that was the last time that I was actually inside the store in Tampa. You know, I packed what wasn't staying with me and put it in the station wagon and came up here. Between the time that Gary moved up here to Orlando, and this is the house that he bought, between the time that Gary moved up here, we let the apartment that we were living in go. So I had to stay in the store for about 6 months, sleeping on the floor every night. I had my dog, Macbeth, with me. Macbeth was a pretty little chocolate cocker spaniel, and even though he was a little bitch sometimes, we got along very well, and so he and I camped out in the store for about 6 months until we were able to come up here. So when we came up, I had, you know, money from the sale, so I decided, well, I would start out and about books. So between March and May, I, you know, did, you know, my preliminary kind of stuff, like trying to find a place. So I went to Felix Power, who was a local real estate agent at the time, he showed me, you know, a couple of places, and then he showed me the store on Mills. It had been a pawn shop, and it was, you know, a lot bigger than the store that I had been at, about twice as big, or maybe even more. But I decided on that spot. Somebody suggested that I open at the Parliament House or over on OBT Trail. And after, well, I mean, I been to the Parliament House with Gary a couple of times since we've been here. Nothing against the Parliament House, but the area just was not a place that I wanted to be in every day. It didn't. It was just at the time, and I don't know how it is now, but at the time, it was pretty seedy, and I didn't want to be there in that kind of environment. You know, nothing against the Parliament House. I've been there many times, and I'm very sad that it is gone and torn down, and it's a big part of the history of Orlando. But it just wasn't the place for me to open the store. So we opened on Mills, which was actually a good choice. From the beginning, you know, we were successful. And, you know, part of our marketing strategy was to, especially in Tampa with Tomes and Treasures, we would go to, you know, church picnics, or we would go to dances that Dignity or the NBA or whatever would throw. We would go anywhere, any public event was going on, dealing with the gay and lesbian experience. We would, you know, we would go, and we would often set up a booth with books, and we got to be very expert at, you know, packing and unpacking and displaying, and so we continued that here in Orlando for to a lesser extent. We would go to the NBA meetings and set up an exhibit, or we went to the church maybe once or twice, but the store was bigger. We had more customers. We had more things on our plate, so we didn't do as many outside events as we did in Tampa. We still did all the picnics and parades and things like that, but we didn't do quite as many as we would have done in Tampa. And especially after the first year or so, it became more difficult to get out of the store and go to these places. So, we tried to bring them into the store by doing, you know, different kinds of things. One of my ideas was that when I came to Orlando, that it was going to be, you know, a business, and I did want it to succeed, but I also wanted to make sure that I had fun doing it. So we started doing theatrical events in the back of the store. The first one was a kind of a mashup of Janie, the musical version of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and another little skit that I and my friend Jorge Martinez came up with, which was basically a skit, This Is Your Life, Betty Davis. So I was Betty, Jorge was John. I called him the Cuban John Crawford for years afterwards. And so that was the first of the theatrical events that we did. So that was, I think that was in October in 1993. For our first anniversary in the store of May of 1993, we planned a whole month kind of thing of different things. We had Glimpses, which was a series of one-act plays, and the Hatbox Review, which was Larry Tackett, Andre Provencher, David Amida, Tommy Gerard, Tommy Mangieri, same person, different name. Catherine Goodison, several other people were part of a group a theater group called the Hatbox Review. And Lou Ruth was another theatrical guy. He did act out theater in the first few years that I was here, and then he was part of the Betty Davis event. But the Glimpses was a series of one-act plays that they did at the store. And then we had our friend Kate Hoey, who was an artist. So she did an art exhibit on that week. And then the rest of the month we had other artists who did different art exhibits. We had John Watts, who did male nude drawings, charcoal drawings. We had Dawn Rosendahl and Cheryl Turner. They later did things like classical sculpture kind of things in resin. David and the Three Graces and just Bacchus, fawns, things like that. But their exhibit was a little bit different. They had two that I can remember vaguely. It's been so long ago that I don't remember all the details of it, but one was a box, and I think it had a Nixon mask and a recording of Nixon speaking. And another one, I think it was The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I don't remember all the details on their exhibit. They might remember some of it, but they were involved in the History Museum when it first began. So you might contact them at some point and ask them about that. But in Mother Earth Ocean Works, they did pottery. I think they were one of the exhibitors that first month. And then after that we did basically kind of like an artist of the month. So we had photographers, we had neon sculptures. Chris Coyle, she did these neon pieces across, kind of a Gothic kind of cross in neon. The United States with outlined in neon. Different kinds of things like that. So we tried to, encourage the local people, if they had some sort of product that they wanted to sell, or had some sort of vision that they wanted to bring to the world. We tried to encourage them as much as we could and offer them a space. where they could, set up for, a while and maybe sell a couple pieces, or at least get people to know who they were, and we tried to encourage, the theater. Like I said, we did theatrical events twice a year, once in April, once in October for several years. And then, of course, we, if they had something going on, we put their posters up, if people had businesses, we had a big bulletin board at the front of the store where they could post their flyers and posters and put their business cards out, we always had like a little jar somewhere in the store where people could make a donation to Centaur or Hope and Help or whatever. We did the Betty Davis event that we did was a fundraiser for Centaur and Hope and Help. We did it a couple of different nights. It was a big event. We had Charlie Callahan, who was the director of the Gay Men's Chorus at the time. He had antique cars. So me as Betty and Jorge as Joan and our co-stars went out the back door of the building and got into the car and had him drive us around where we could make our entrance, like Hollywood movie stars. Then we had the fans out front, and of course they were getting into it. They were cheering and shouting and taking pictures and whatever. And then we led them into our theater, which was basically our back room with chairs, and we did it very professionally, though, because we had lights. We had Laura Morakowitz, who was doing the lights for us. I had my makeup and hairdresser, who was playing a part in the Janie musical, and we had set. Gary built us a stage, a little stage, and they did a backdrop, so for my part of the show, I was Betty, and Ralph Edwards, played by Lou Ruth, said, "Betty Davis, this is your life." And I was on stage with Lou, and he introduced my people from my past, like my sister Bobby, who was played by Catherine Goodison as kind of a nutty, crazy bag lady kind of thing. And I would say things like, "They let you out of the Francis Farmer Institute for this?" And John Sullivan, who played Errol Flynn, Michael, I forget his last name right now, but I think he played my ex-husband Gary Merrill, and of course Joan, played by Jorge Martinez. We did a little dance to Bosom Buddies from the Broadway show Mame. We'll always be bosom buddies, friends, sisters, and pals. And then I wheeled her off of the stage or pushed her off the stage in her wheelchair. I had Gary to build a ramp so he wouldn't kill himself when I pushed him off the stage. And then we had sound effects with, you know, like pots clanging and, you know, brakes squealing or whatever, as Jorge went off the stage. So, and then the next part of the show was Janie the musical, which was, you know, one of the funniest things you could ever see. And the store next door, Ritzy Rags, was owned by Nancy. I can't remember her last name right now, but she let us kind of use that as a dressing room for the night, or for the 2 nights that we did it. And so we'd go out one door and go into her door and come in through our front door, or, you know, vice versa, or whatever. So so we had it all worked out, and it was a big event, and it all came off wonderfully well, and we had a great time doing it. So I decided, well, we'll do the same kinds of things, you know. So we did something, you know, usually in April or May, and then something in October. So we did selections from Shakespeare one year. We did like 3 different scenes from Shakespeare. One of them was the witches scene, which is always one of my favorites. And I was one of the witches. We did Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, so I was Lady Macbeth. And the other, we had other, you know, cast members who were part of Hatbox Review, or, you know, or just friends who wanted to participate. We did all kinds of silly stuff, but like I said, we had fun doing it, so that was the main thing. What's Eating Norma was one of our last ones that we did. That was kind of a takeoff of Sunset Boulevard and Designing Women. So, so I was Betty. Dennis Enos was Joan. I forget the guy who played Fat Marilyn, Marilyn Monroe, who had gained a little bit of weight because she'd been eating. And Jim Crescitelli played Ethel Merman. So the 4 of them go to Norma Desmond's house, and Norma Desmond, let's just say, I won't give away the plot of it, but let's just say there was cannibalism involved, and double crossing and double dealing, and at the time Gary was kind of sick, so I couldn't really be a big part of it. So I said, okay, let's rewrite this. So I let Jim Crescitelli rewrite the script, where they had a bigger part and I had only like a few lines at the beginning, and of course Betty always comes out on top, so at the end she is the only survivor, let's put it that way. Or she thinks she's the only survivor. Let's put it that way. So those are kinds of things that we did, and then you know, as we discussed earlier, things started to get a little bit tense at the store right around the end of 1995, 96. I don't remember whether it was 1995 or 1996 when Rainbow City came into existence, but it was at the end of the year, and in the beginning, said that we would work together and, be friendly business people. Didn't work out that way. He had come to me earlier and said that he was opening a store a couple of doors down to sell gifts. And when I told Gary that, he said, watch out for him. He's got something up his sleeve. And it turned out to be the case because soon after he started becoming a little bit more aggressive with us as far as what he was carrying in his store. He had said that he was going to carry books. Well, soon it became a case where I opened the paper one day and saw that he was carrying books. And so I called him and asked him about it, and he said, well, that was then, this is now. And so things were not happy around there for the longest time. I was dealing with not only, the big box stores, and the internet was starting to affect, a lot of small businesses. Especially bookstores. Any niche bookseller was having a harder time because they could get the same thing online. With him there and him being I will just say this about him. He was a shrewd businessman. He saw that I was doing well. He saw that the store was doing well. So he took advantage of that and, set up close to me. He didn't really have to advertise because, people knew about us, and so they would see him. And then it gradually became a case of, them thinking that we were them or that they were us. So, for people who didn't know. So it became a point of contention for me, and I became angrier and angrier. I did attempt to smooth things over at one point, and I thought maybe that would work, but it didn't, because shortly after that he started putting signs up on his building saying that anybody who wasn't a customer of his would be towed, and I don't remember if anybody was actually towed or not, but I know that at least a couple of times one of the people from his store would come into my store and say, does anybody have such and such a car? It's going to be towed if you don't move it or whatever. So, things like that. He even threatened to have the Metropolitan Business Association, who had their meetings, their board meetings, once a month at our store. He even threatened to have them towed because they parked in his spots. So things like that. And at the time I was also dealing with Gary being sick quite often, and so I was stressed out, and if I was a bitch about things at times, well, why. You can understand, I'm sure, that with all these different things going on, that I was an emotional wreck, basically, at times. But I still went into the store every day. And then finally, in 1997, September of 1997, Gary went into the hospital for the last time. he had toxoplasmosis, which is one of the opportunistic diseases, and it's not a very nice picture either. He had been complaining about his hand being numb, so I said, well, go to the doctor, talk to your doctor. And when he did, they put him in the hospital, and said that he had toxoplasmosis. And toxoplasmosis is a disease that you can get from either birds or from cats who, of course, eat birds. And we had a cat at the time, and the doctor had told us to get rid of him, but Gary said no, he wasn't going to get rid of the cat. So Gary was in the hospital and started getting worse and worse. He was there for about a week, and the last day I went in, that was October 2nd. Last day I went in, and he seemed okay. I mean, not well, but he seemed like he was all right at the moment. But as I was leaving, one of the nurses gave me such a look of pity that I thought, what the hell is wrong with her? So evidently they knew that he was dying, and that it wouldn't be long before he was gone. I went to the store, and I got a call from no, you're okay. This was probably the worst day in my life. I get a call from my mother in Kentucky. My grandmother, her mother, had died. So I went into the back room and sat down and cried for a couple of minutes, and then came out and continued along with my work. Told my mother that I probably couldn't come to the funeral because of Gary being in the hospital and him being so ill. I told her that I probably couldn't be there, and she said, don't worry about it. If anybody else has a problem with it, I'll deal with it. Anyway, I went back to work, and Gary and I had a deal when he first got sick that he would deal with his medical stuff. I would help if he needed help, but he would deal with his medical stuff. I would deal with the store because that was our only income at the time. He'd been fired from his job as a mechanic about a year before, around Christmas time. The store was our only income. He had disability, but that's not a whole lot. So the store was our only income, and so I had to be at the store. A friend of ours, Jerry, went to see him that day, and she calls me and tells me that he's having trouble breathing. And I'm being completely oblivious to the whole thing. I thought, well, he's having some issues. They'll put him on oxygen or something. Things will be okay. I was trying to delude myself that, this was not happening. So I continued, and when I closed the store, I went to the hospital. Patty Sheehan was there. Wade Wise, a friend of ours, was there. Jerry, her husband Jim, and her young son Jeffrey were in the room. When I opened the door to the hospital room, I could hear him gasping for breath. So I couldn't deal with it at the moment. I turned around and walked to the solarium, sat down. Jim came and sat with me for a few minutes. I collected myself, went back into the room, and so they were there around his bed, and he was gasping for breath, and I said, Jerry, could you do me a favor? Could you go to my house and pick up a book for me called The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis? It's part of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I wanted to read the last chapter of that book to him as he was leaving us. She said, I don't think there's going to be enough time. You know the story. Sit down and tell him the story. So I sat down on his bed, and while I was telling him, what I could remember of the story, he passed away. Part of the story is they're basically, the characters are dying, but they're on this train, which is, a train to wherever, to the afterlife, and the words that stick in my mind are the words further on and further up. So that's when he left, and friends gathered around me. The next day I went into the store. Debbie Tucci from Centaur came in. Steve Roberts, my accountant, came in. Tom Dyer with Watermark. Everybody came in and were trying to help me. Larry was there. He had worked for me for a while, 2 or 3 years. He was a director with the Hatbox Review, and he worked at the store also, and he watched the store for me. Mary Brooks, I think, used her frequent flyer miles, got me a trip home to Kentucky so I could say goodbye to my grandmother while Gary was, in the hospital. I made arrangements to have him cremated, and when I got back, we got all the details worked out, and life without Gary began. And so for a couple of years, I continued with the store. Things weren't quite as, they weren't the same. I really didn't want to do as many outside events. I didn't want to do, the theatrical stuff. We still did things, but not on the scale that we did before. And finally I came to the decision that it was time for me to close. So in 2001, January 31st was supposed to be our last day. But at the very end, somebody came to me and said that they wanted to buy some of the stock. So I thought they were going to buy, everything, but they didn't. And So I had put a deposit down, and I made arrangements with the landlord to continue to be open during February. So actually February 28th would have been or my last day at the store. So, and after that, I went on to work for a stamp auction company who auctioned off rare and unique stamps, postage stamps, after them, I worked for them part-time. I worked for House of Flowers. I worked for Twisted Palms part-time. Twisted Palms was a store over at the Parliament House. They had been on Mills originally, and then moved to the leather store that had opened up. Absolute Leather had moved from OBT over to where we were. Twisted Palms moved in with them, and then they moved over to the Parliament House. So, we were all kind of interconnected, and we tried to support each other quite a bit. For a lot of gay businesses, it's tough to survive because your pool of potential customers is smaller than than a Home Depot would be, or a Barnes and Noble, or any of the large corporate entities. So I was really happy when the history project began. I didn't know about it until after the first year, but after the first year, I went to I guess their first year, I actually saw the exhibit that they did at the History Museum downtown, the Orlando History Museum. They did a one-day exhibit, and then the next year we did one at there, and by that time I was involved. All the stuff that I had collected, pictures and flyers and posters and that sort of stuff, I was glad to have a place that could take them where I didn't have to continue tripping over them. My Spectrum Awards are there. I maybe should have kept those, but I still remember them. So they're in good hands. So that's just kind of a brief overview. Well, I say brief. It took an hour. That's just an overview. So if you have any questions, let me know.
So Bruce, what was the social climate like during the 1980s and 90s as a gay man?
Well, in the 1980s, I would have come out. Coming from a rural background, I can remember sitting in the church and thinking that my feelings were the result of the devil. However, I did read something that convinced me that organized religion was pretty much of a bunk, and it changed a lot of the ways that I thought. So I can't remember the title of the book, but part of it was, the subtitle was The Fallacy of the Virgin Birth, which kind of discussed, how religions kind of, the Christian religion kind of came from the Jewish and the Greek religions, where Christianity, Jesus Christ, the resemblances between Dionysus and Jesus Christ. So that changed the way that I thought about religion. And after that, I can remember reading in the newspaper about the University of Indiana having a gay group, and thinking, okay, well, I want to go to the University of Indiana. Well, of course, that wasn't what happened, but my first day at the university that I did go to, I thought, okay, this is my time. This is when I'm going to become super gay. This is where I'm going to learn what it is to be like. And my roommate comes into the room and says something like, "Oh, well, we'll get along with each other as long as you're not gay." And I thought, oh, okay, well, that kind of puts a kibosh on my plans. So I wasn't ready to come out yet. I had to wander through a few other years of hiding, things from myself and from my friends and from my family. And finally, I won't go into the story, but afterwards I came out to the first person, Jessica Ralston. We sat on the, there was a kind of auditorium by the, an outdoor auditorium by the Fine Arts Center at the school, kind of columns and stuff at the top. And, so I guess that was a fairly fitting place to come out. She was the first person that I said the words to, "I'm gay." So after that, I became a slut. And then I met Richard, and he kind of introduced me to the gay world that was not, all sex related. Of course, much of our life together was related to sex. I mean, when you're with someone, that's what you do. You have sex. But you also grow as people together somehow, some way. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, I guess. But Richard, he introduced me to gay literature. I really had no idea that there was anything like that. He gave me a copy of, or he had a copy of either The Front Runner or The Fancy Dancer by Patricia Warren. both famous gay titles. I don't know if you've ever heard of them or read them or not, but back in the 80s, those were the first novels that most people who were gay ever read that were somewhat affirming and not, you know, the gay person dies at the end, or, you know, commits suicide or whatever. So, so he actually introduced me to gay literature, and then when we moved to Tampa, he became involved with the Tampa Bay Business Guild, which was a gay business group, kind of like the Metropolitan Business Association. So I started meeting people through that, and realized that, you know, we're everywhere. You know, we're in real estate, we're in medicine, we're in every industry you could hope to imagine. So that's when, you know, I guess my political awakening started. And then when I got into the store, it multiplied, because there were things going on in Tampa at that time, like the Human Rights Ordinance. The Human Rights Ordinance for the county, not the city, but for the county, was up for discussion as to whether to add gays and lesbians to the Human Rights Ordinance for the county. And it became a big to-do. And one of our candidates that we backed, Phyllis Busansky, said, "Oh yes, I'm in complete support with you." And then when it came time for the vote, she voted against the ordinance, adding it to the ordinance. So that was, I guess, our first betrayal that I can remember on a political scene. And this was during the years of George W. Bush. So early on, he was in Tampa for something, and they closed off our street that went by the front of the store, Howard Avenue, and there was no traffic going up the street, so we were kind of wondering what was going on. And then we found out that it was Bush's motorcade going from wherever he was at to the airport. So myself and the people who lived in the houses that were in front of us, both gay or gay friendly, we went out to the driveway, and as Bush's motorcade was driving by, we were shouting, "Where was Bush?" And because of his policies on AIDS and all that other stuff. So AIDS was, you know, from the early 80s on into the 90s, was an ever-present kind of thing in the gay community. You couldn't help but know somebody who either had AIDS or had died of AIDS, or you know, Gary was HIV positive when we met, and even though I tried to break up with him once, he wasn't having that. So you know, we stayed together. I wasn't HIV positive, and you know, we had a good sex life, and a good life together. So it was all in how you lived your life, I guess, whether you were positive about it or whether you were going to be negative about it, no matter what. But the political, that was part of the politics. I mean, there were ACT UP groups that started, there were marches and protesting, and, you know, I would speak to the news people whenever they wanted a story on the Human Rights Ordinance. They usually came to me, and unfortunately sometimes if they came to me, my hair was a mess or I hadn't shaved or something. So, you know, I think I put forward a good image for the community, but you know, you never know. I wish I could see some of those old videos and see what it looked like at that time, whether or not I'm just being too hard on myself or whether I'm remembering things correctly or not. But you know, the Human Rights Ordinance was a big deal, and that's when Tampa really started awakening politically, and there were a lot of things going on. So a lot of groups were, you know, forming and you know, being active within the community. The line, the gay hotlines. There were one in St. Pete. There's one in Tampa. So there were people active in trying to, in Tampa, Orlando was about at the same point politically and socially as Tampa was at that time. So I was lucky to be in on 2 different Florida cities coming into their power. And you know, I did as much as I could and helped as many groups and people as I could. PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, the Gay Parents Association, GOBCC, or GOB, whatever it was, GOBS. I kid that every year they add another letter to it. LGBT, GLCS, LMNOQ. You know, the center was originally in a, when I came up, it was in a building where it was a house at one time. It was a 2-story house, and the center moved from there to another little strip on Mills, and there's a Burger King, or there was a Burger King at where the old GOB CC or whatever it's called. I don't know anymore what to call it. The center, where the center was. Okay, so there's now a Burger King there, or was a Burger King there, and then they moved, and then they moved to where their present location is, I think, from the place on Mills. I'm not sure if there was a place in between there or not. But the NBA was just starting, and they became a big organization. They started the Coming Out with Pride event in October. It kind of took the place of the June Pride Parade because, you know, in June it's so hot, horrible outside. So October is a better time for it. So they were with the I think with the student group at UCF. They started to come out with pride celebrations, and you know, between that time, I mean, I was on the board for a short time, maybe 2 years or so. Debbie Simmons was president for like 400 years, and she led them from almost the beginning up until just a few years ago. I don't know. Other groups, and you know, I involved myself with a lot of the theater groups here in Orlando. So all of these, you know, people were part of it. They helped, you know, bring things into the mainstream, which in some ways is good, in some ways it's not so good, because it's not you don't get as many negative reactions from people if you say, oh, well, I'm gay, than you would from back in those times. But some of the excitement has gone out of it. You know, we don't have as much to yell about and scream about as we did, so things aren't quite as fun anymore.
I know that the bar and club scene was big back then. Was there any other avenues for gay people to socialize in?
Well, there were things like the Metropolitan Community Church, and there were other groups like Dignity, which was a gay Catholic group, which, of course, I'm not sure which pope put an end to it, but they kind of basically threw them out. But there were always different groups where, you know, there were people who didn't go to the bars, or even if you did go to the bar, you still might want to do something different on, you know, during the daytime. You might want to go. There are things like gay skate or sports or things like that. The bowling league. So there were always outlets besides the bar if you wanted to take them.
How did gay people interact with lesbians during this time?
I always had a lot of women friends, because, you know, they came into the store and they bought lots of stuff, so I loved them. Oftentimes they were better friends to me than some of the gay men. I think it all depends, I think, on an individual basis. I think that during the AIDS crisis, a lot of the women stood up and did a lot of the things for the men that a lot of the men just weren't going to do or were incapable of doing. They, you know, they had the empathy to visit people who were sick or dying. I'm not saying that the men didn't, but the women were more of a caregiver type of mentality than the men were. I always thought that you know, we always got along well together. Of course, there were some people on the end of both. There were women who didn't want to have anything to do with men, no matter whether they were gay or not. And there were men who didn't want to have anything to do with women, whether they were gay or not. But I think all in all that our communities pretty much meshed well together, because every group that I saw had a good mix of men and women.
Okay. Was race ever an issue during this time?
Race is always an issue. I tend to think that everyone is racist to some extent. It depends on how you try to deal with it. There are some people who just will not deal with it and will be horrible and mean and nasty no matter what. There are some people who realize that their ideas or their preconceived notions are a bunch of bullshit and try to do things differently than maybe their parents would. Let me give you a story from my childhood, which has always been kind of a way that I can understand race relations. When I was a kid, we were poor. Basically, we were poor, so we had to go to the laundromat in Smith's Grove to do our clothes. So my mother would usually take me, because it probably would not be a good idea to leave me anywhere alone, especially if there were maybe things to get in trouble with. So I always was with, my mother or father. They would always take me along with them wherever they went, basically to keep me out of trouble. So at the laundromat, I was outside playing with two little black children. We were having the time of our lives. And my mother came to me and pulled me away and said something like, you don't need to play with them. It might rub off on you. And I know that my mother was a racist. I can firmly state that. But that incident always stayed with me. And I tried to, well, for me, I would have loved to have the color rub off on me. I mean, that would be something different, something exciting to me. And I always had friends who were black, and a lot of times it didn't sit well with other people, but I really didn't care what other people thought. Obviously, I've done a lot of things that people would in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, would either raise their eyebrows at or have an apoplectic fit if they knew some of the things that I've done. So I think it really depends on the person. My brothers and sisters, I would say, took more after my mother than I did. I tried to, since I think being gay has a lot to do with my look at other people just as people, not as a black person or as a brown person or as a white person or as an Asian or whatever. So I try to make sure that but I know that there are racist thoughts inside of me, but I try not to let them out. And I try not to hurt other people. And unfortunately, most people, you know, they don't either realize that they're being insensitive or they don't care. One or the other. But as far as in the gay community, you know, I really didn't notice a separation until I came to Orlando, and then I saw that there was a gay bar that was primarily black that opened up on Bennett Road. I really didn't know that there was a need or a desire for, you know, something like that. Because whenever you went to Parliament House or whatever, you would see all different races on the dance floor, or on the balconies, or in the courtyard. So I really didn't see it until they opened up, and then I guess I realized maybe that there was, you know, a separation.
Bruce, in what ways do you feel that the LGBTQ community has evolved from your initial contact decades ago?
Well, nowadays, of course, the trans community is more often in the news than the gay and lesbian community. So I personally, well, I do know a couple of trans people, not well, but I have met trans people. So I'm not really conversant with the trans movement. Right now, on RuPaul's Drag Race, there's a female-to-male transsexual who is competing. So 15, 20 years ago, that would not have been something that you would have seen even in the drag bars, I don't think. You might have seen the people who were transitioning, who were taking the hormone shots or whatever, and developing breast or whatever, but you wouldn't have seen a full transsexual, especially a female to male, doing drag. So I think that that's an exciting thing that's happening. I will say that I don't understand transsexuality myself, but that doesn't mean that it's not a valid lifestyle. It does not mean that you know, people can discriminate against them because of something you don't understand. I mean, I don't understand wanting to be a different sex myself, but I can understand that other people might feel that they were born into the wrong body and wanting to change it. So I think that that's probably the biggest thing that we're seeing nowadays. But as far as other changes go, of course, you know, we have the legal right to marry. When Gary and I were together, Gary would have wanted to be married. However, I resisted it because I did not think that I could stand up in front of people and make a promise that, you know, to love, honor, and don't mess around with anybody else, I could actually do with a straight face or with all honesty. Not that I you know, let me say it this way. I did love Gary. I did honor Gary, and I was loyal to Gary, but I wasn't always so faithful to Gary. Let's just put it that way. So I didn't feel that I could myself do a holy union kind of thing. But now, if Gary were here, I would, you know, grab him by the hand and get him to the church and, you know, and stand up and say vows and because it's legal for us to do so, I would want to take advantage of it. Because you never know, with the Supreme Court, they might say, oh, well, we made a mistake. So that's another big change. Gays in the military, that was a big issue back in the early 90s. I never wanted to. I was briefly in the Navy. I won't go into that, but let's just say that it was not a good fit. I left honorably, but it just was not a good fit. I could not, and immediately after that I came out, you know, to the first person that I came out to, so so I was going through, you know, other things at the time too. You know, gay people are serving honorably in the military. Trans people are serving honorably in the military. Even though there are people who would try to, you know, kick them out for even wanting to be in the military. So, you know, there've been a lot of changes, and like I said, I think that you know, it's a mostly positive thing that we have become more mainstream and are more able to be involved in everyday American life on equal footing with everybody else. But, you know, there are some things that we miss. We miss going out and you know, protesting and marching and yelling and screaming and raging against the machine. You know, there are things that you know, that I miss about the old days, and I miss having the store. I mean, that's a big change personally for me. I miss being able to, you know, go in and talk to people, and a lot of times people would come in with, you know, their own issues and want something to help them deal with those issues. Like a gay parent, I've dealt with a lot of parents of people who were gay and lesbian, and there were people that were, you know, sometimes on the verge of tears because they didn't understand what was going on. And a lot of times I was able to help them with the book, or just by saying, well, not alone, there's an organization that you might want to check out, talk to people there. So I miss kind of being able to help people solve their own problems. And even though people are coming out at early ages now, which, you know, is, for me, I'm glad that I went through whatever struggles I went through to get to, you know, where I was able to come out to myself and to other people. You know, I'm glad that they are having not as hard a time of it as I did. And I didn't really have a hard time. I mean, when I told my parents, my mother said, well, I kind of already knew because I read something you had written. And then after she died, I found what I had written in her, in her bedroom when I was going through all of her stuff. And, it's kind of a poem or something about Richard or something like that. And she said, well, I kind of knew already. And when I told my dad, he was sitting on the back porch in a lawn chair, relaxing after a day of doing whatever he'd been doing. And so I go outside and sit in a chair and say, well, you know what, our neighbor Dorotha had asked me if I was ever going to get married, and I said, probably not. I said, you know what I told Dorotha about me being married? And he said, yeah. He was very quiet and very calm, and I said, well, I'm gay. And he didn't say anything. And a couple of minutes went by, he still hadn't said anything. So I went inside and I said, Mama, I told him and he's not speaking to me. He's not saying anything to me. So I don't know if he's mad at me or if he just didn't hear me. Because when I was a kid, he lost his hearing from an accident that he had when he was working on a car. So so he couldn't hear out of one ear. So I went back up. She said, well, go back outside and talk to him again. So I went back outside and I said, Daddy, did you hear what I told you? And he said, yes. And I said, well, what do you think about it? He said, well, it's your life and you have to live it the way you see fit. And I thought, well, it's not a ringing endorsement, but I'm going to take it. So I ran back inside and I said, okay, that's done.
What would you say to young LGBTQ people or those who are coming along in the future? What would you say to young LGBTQ people or those who are coming along in the future? Like, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would say that be yourself, number one. People are going to tell you no a lot of times. Sometimes it's probably, good advice, but it's not always going to be good advice when people tell you not to do something or not to be the way that you are, that you know that you are. Don't always listen to what everybody else says to you. You have to make up your own mind, as to what's best for you. I could have married a woman, I guess, and had kids, and been unhappy and made my wife unhappy, and most likely kids unhappy. But instead of doing that, I chose to live my life the way that I saw fit. So that's my father's advice to me stands for everyone. Live your life the way you see fit, and most often you'll come out okay.
Is there anything else that you would like to discuss?
There are tons of things that happen that I'm also trying to write down all my memories. I'm working on my earlier memories right now. I've already done my memories of myself and Richard together, and my memories of myself and Gary together. I've gotten those written down. One of these days I will, and I'm just writing them down. I'm not trying to be literate about it. I'm just trying to get the memories onto paper so that one of these days maybe somebody will be interested enough to say, oh, well, let's see what happened to Bruce and Gary during their time together. And you know, everybody has a story, and some stories are more interesting than others. Mine may be a little more interesting than some and a little less interesting than others, but it's still my story, and so I want to try to make sure that, you know, what I remember is at least set down on paper and has a chance of surviving after I do. So at some point I'll be finished, maybe. I may never be finished because you know, every time you remember one thing, some other memory pops up and you think, oh, well, just jot it down real quick, and then you go back and you keep remembering more and more and more things that happen to you. So that's the process that I'm in right now, just trying to remember a lot of the little things. And, you know, I can remember more feelings than actual events, you know, like summertime in Kentucky, you know, seeing the heat rising in the morning from the fields, and there's kind of a shimmer in the air, and you hear crickets and grasshoppers and birds, and at night fireflies dancing through the air, and hearing off in the distance the call of a bobwhite or another bird or whatever, and sitting on the porch with parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and listening to stories of things that happened even before you during their time, and sometimes even before their time, that they've heard from their parents. So it just keeps on going and going and going. There's one story from my childhood about a Confederate soldier whose head was chopped off, and he was supposed to be carrying his head around in his hands at this certain spot. And come to find out that the story is based on actual occurrences, and I may actually have found the person who was murdered by asking, you know, questions about the story to my father when he was alive, and then an accidental correspondence with somebody else who lived in the area years ago. I may actually have found out who the guy was who got killed. So those are the things that kind of interest me, and I have the diaries from the little person, the Ida Washer. She kept diaries from like the 1930s on up to the 1970s. My sister got them. She sent copies to me. I transcribed them all. And so there's mentions of my father being born. There's mentions of me being born. And how much I weighed. You know, things like that. And then when I was a kid growing up, there were these letters from the early 1900s from this man to his wife, and before she became his wife. So they were love letters between these two people, and they were part of, you know, my dad's estate sale mania kind of thing. And you know, they discuss you know, all kinds of things that happened in the early 1900s and even before that. So these are the kinds of things that interest me, and I try to, you know, like you guys are doing with the history project. These are things that interest me. And, you know, we did a video on Orlando, out in Orlando. After I closed the store, I had to do something, and this was a project that, you know, I got involved in. So we went to Parliament House and filmed at Parliament House and all these other bars and businesses, and so there's copies of it in the museum, I'm sure, because I know I gave them to the museum. And there are, you know, not just the finished product, but there are, you know, all the footage that we took. So there's hours and hours of footage from the early 2000s of gay Orlando. So I can't think of anything else. Oh, well, I'm sure I can think of many, many other things and talk for hours and hours and hours, but I'm not going to. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to talk to us today. The LGBTQ History Museum in Central Florida and I are greatly appreciative of the amount of information you provided in order for us to preserve your history and add it to our reservoir.
Well, I appreciate being asked. You know, sometimes I think that maybe I'm a little bit forgotten, but you know, I'm still around, still willing to help out in any way that I can, and I mean, I was a big part of the community at one time, and I may not have loved every minute of it, but most of it I enjoyed. So, I was lucky enough to be involved in both Tampa and Orlando at a time when it was burgeoning and becoming a safer, more accepting place for gay and lesbian people. And you know, if I was a part of that, I'm happy to have done it. So, thank you.
Thank you.